Hi, and welcome to CryptoBiography. I'm your host, Brandon Starr, and this is episode 81. It's going to be Annie and the Magician, part 7. And if you have any comments or questions about this episode or previous episodes, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Twitter or Facebook. And here we go. They settled into a habit which Anastasia, having spent her time in the kitchens, would never have thought could be comfortable until she did it. In the kitchens, she would often be sent out either to deliver food, fetch someone, or get something that cook needed. Though she had long hours every day, she had people to talk to. None of that was the case here, except the long hours. She spent increasing hours ethering, but also Query had started to teach her how to take raw ether and finish it. Regardless of her activity, she was never bored, and missed the company of the kitchens only in the sense that occasionally she would realize she hadn't said a single word in half a day. Completing the ether involved different processes for different ethers. In general, there was a lot of filtering the ether through, over, or around substances, sometimes with heat, sometimes not. Sometimes a single pass was all it took, other times it took multiple steps, some taking days. Anastasia asked Query how he had learned the recipes to finish all the ethers. Many from my master, but almost half I have found or created myself. I do not recommend you try creating new recipes at first, nor deviate from my recipes even an iota. Wild ethers can have different effects than intended and can be dangerous in the extreme. I am fortunate that I have all of my limbs and digits and no disfiguring scars. You have other scars? Anastasia asked. Corey simply pulled up his shirt. His right side, all the way down, had a strange mark on it, like a burn, but quite purple. One of my first few experiments got away from me, he explained. I'm fortunate that over the years the pain has gone away, though I have little feeling anywhere the scar touches. I believe I escaped other long-term damage, though it is not impossible. Please, apprentice, take my advice and be careful when it comes time for you to dabble in new ethers. Anastasia nodded. So she practiced. She became more and more precise, day by day, and she was glad that, even when she had simply been cleaning the equipment, Query had prepared her by insisting everything be done perfectly. Still, there were accidents and near accidents. The worst of these happened at the end of a long day when both of them were tired. Anastasia had bumped a flask filled with ether which was taking on the properties of a certain type of stone. It shattered, but the ether fortunately was moving away from her and didn't splash her. The ether had torn holes in the wood of the table and even dinged the stone floor some. Another lesson learned, Query said. He sent her to sleep, but in the morning had her clean and repair the damage done. Some of the repairs were done with an ether, and this part she did not consider a punishment at all, but an interesting lesson. The ether, which Query referred to as the undoer, did just that. It undid any changes something had undergone recently. Well, not any changes, apparently. She wasn't sure what all the limitations were. But in the case of physical damage, even one caused by ethers, it could repair it. Sadly, it doesn't help heal, Query said. I've tried. The problem seems to be that living things are changing all the time, so when damage is done, by the time the ether might be applied, the creature has already undergone its own changes, so instead of healing the wound, the ether undoes the natural processes of the body. This, as you might expect, does great harm rather than heal. Still, it was interesting watching the ether undo the damage done the previous night to the table. The floor's damage was too minor to waste ether on. As she poured it on the wood, drop by drop, humming the notes specific to this ether that Query had taught her, she could see holes in the wood contract, level out, and return to their undamaged state. She kept a part of the table unfixed until May arrived with the morning meal. May, watch this, she said. She put a few drops on, humming under her breath, and the table fixed itself. Wonderful, yes? Yes, May said. She was staring at the place where the ether was still there. Wet, but not obviously magical at all. Can you fix anything? Anything, Anastasia said. Well, not people. This doesn't work on living tissue. It's something my master and I are working on. May looked at her oddly, as though she wanted to say something. Perhaps she thought Anastasia was being too full of herself. Perhaps it was something else. But then she just nodded and the moment passed. May excused herself, and Anastasia went back to her studies, and prepared for a good ethering before lunch. The days drew on, and little changed. Anastasia had learned a good dozen ethers, their ways of being made, their proper application, and their weaknesses. "How do you find the proper song when you make a new ether?" Anastasia asked one morning after May had left a breakfast, this time without a word. She also had a black eye. Anastasia was polite enough not to ask. Cook sometimes had a bad temper, especially if he was catching heat from his superiors. Query took some time to answer. "It's more difficult than finding your own song, which springs from inside you," he said. He chewed a rasher of bacon, then took a swig of wine, which he had started taking at all meals. In an odd way, like our own songs, which as far as I know are unique to every magician, the songs are unique to every ether. Change the song and you will change the effects or potency of the ether, at least a little. The difference is that we find the songs. We find them inside ourselves for our own ether, and we find them in the ether when we apply them. When you concentrate hard on what the ether is, what it does, you'll find that the song matches. Try it today on the songs I've taught you. They're anything but random. Then eventually you may hear songs calling out to you, new ethers wishing to be made. Being, of course, cautious, he added, pointing at his shirt where his scar lay hidden underneath. That afternoon, Query decided to do some scouting. So far as I know, Cupigula is not here permanently. We need to know when he leaves, and if he leaves any of his allies behind. Eventually I also hope to find who he's making into his spies, for surely he will. "I appreciate that you know the castle well and can move through without a suspicion," he said, seeing her about to protest, "but I will do this." After making a number of preparations, he left. Anastasia knew it was no good trying for an ethering when she would be fretting, so she set about doing some cleaning. She found that one activity that would, in part, take her mind off her fears. Query returned a few hours later. "I've learned much," he said, removing the cloak he had worn. He had on his special coat under it, as always. "Cupigula is set for a good long stay, at least another month." "A month?" Anastasia asked, shocked. Though she had gotten used to the idea of staying in the room, another month seemed like an enormous amount of time. Query continued, "I don't yet know who he will leave behind, if anyone, and I've started the process of determining who is becoming his spies and allies here in the castle. But for now, let's wait until after lunch, then leave the room and go up to the fresh air above. It's as short a trip as we could like, and we will get fresh air and sunlight, more than we can get by sometimes opening a window." They did so, and in fact picnicked up there, bringing along lunch rather than eating it in the room. They made no indication to May of their plans. Anastasia just sat and relished the sunlight, the breeze, the happy smells, the combination of coolness and warmth. It was over all too soon. "Let's not go so long without that," Query said. "If I sense we're being watched, we can go back to being more careful. But when the weather allows, we should go up again every day or two." Anastasia just beamed her agreement. And that's the end for this week. Obviously, this is one of those in-between bits of the story where things are being set up, things are being slightly resolved, but the big actions have yet to happen. So I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, I am back on track, back on schedule. I'm back in town, of course. I enjoyed spending some time with my family. But it's nice to be back in the saddle, getting back to writing, and getting back to this story. So again, hope you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, cryptobiography@gmail.com, or hit us up on Facebook or Twitter. And we'll see you next week. Words and music, copyright 2019, CryptoBiography LLC, all rights reserved.